the eloquent introduction that my colleague Matthias gave yesterday to our guest, William Fuller. But I should mention that in addition to being a stunning and idiosyncratic poet who manages to splice the dramatic presence of John Donne with the abstract urgency of Jeremy Prynne, to name just two poets whose names end with NNE, in addition to generating productive new configurations of diction and syntax, and in addition to indicating forceful new directions for 21st century lyric practice, Bill is that rarest of breeds, a banker with a PhD in English. As Matthias mentioned yesterday, Bill has worked at the Northern Trust Company for several years. But before Bill began to work at the bank, he earned a PhD at the University of Virginia, writing a dissertation on that master of 17th century prose, Sir Thomas Browne. I mention this only because, as the visual supplement that we've passed out indicates, some material from that earlier inaugural era has made its way into his talk for us today, which is entitled Restatement of Trysts.
Thank you. Actually, I work in the trust department. Those of us in the trust industry think of ourselves not as bankers. Those are the people that make loans and are sort of salesmen. We handle the needs of spoiled rich children, and we're very proud to do that. And whether it's getting them into detox or buying them a new Jaguar or telling them they can't have a new Jaguar, this is.
They can go to detox.
But they can go to detox. Actually, if you go to detox, I'll get you a new Jaguar. Oh, guess what? There's no money left in the trust. So it's a very odd kind of profession, but I've been at it now for 20 years. Seems incredible. In addition, well, I'll talk about that in a second. One thing I need to apologize for several things. First of all, to go all the way back to my last, sort of formal critical writing of my doctoral dissertation to find my subject. But frankly, when you have the job I have is actually pretty much full-time all the time, and so I don't have a lot of time to do extensive reading. So I kind of went back to the cupboard and saw what was there, and I thought, well, maybe I can make stew out of this, and you'll see what I mean. The focus of that was actually on Neoplatonism and started with a long introductory essay on Nicholas of Cusa, and I don't have any of that in here except for a little bit, so I did try and take something different towards it. But the most recent writing I've done for formal presentation has to do with how we're changing our account acceptance procedures at Northern Trust Company to reflect the implementation of the USA Patriot Act as of October 1st. And I just thought maybe people are not generally aware of this, but USA Patriot is actually an acronym. And it stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. So one of the tools that we are now employing is to make sure that everybody who opens a trust gives us their birth date. So, right now, we do. Right now, as one of my colleagues said, legions of trust officers across the country are striding forth in the fight against terrorism by obtaining that key piece of information, a woman's birth date. Oh, there's a talk under here, sorry. The scheme of this paper is essentially to kind of lay out a few notions that have occurred to me over the course of the last 2 months that I've known I had to do this. They then get played out towards the end of the paper in a series of tableaus with various odd pieces of writing that have sort of come my way or were in that cupboard. So there is some sort of, I hope that there's some sort of seed sown somewhere in the paper that makes those tableau make sense, but we'll find out. Restatement of trusts is a standard collection of black letter law for trust departments and trust officers and attorneys. And so that's what I'm referring to in the title. I understand the word tris and trust somehow got together way back in Old Norse, and so I just thought I'd put that in there. It went over very big with our legal department. They were howling at the punch bowl, let me tell you. One further bit of background information is I talk to some extent about a group called the Levelers. Some of you are familiar with, but just in a very thumbnail sketch, I would call these were some writers and activists in the middle of 17th century England who, during the period probably between 1646 and 1649, in the so-called Puritan Revolution, the last phase of it, were very active and were democratic agitators, really the first whose ideas ultimately, I think, found their way into the Bill of Rights Constitution. So they're heroes in my mind. Epigraph from Richard Overton, one of the Levelers, from an appeal. I have discharged the trust of my sufferings unto you, which hath been simply and purely for your sakes. Here is a passage from the beginning section of William Walwyn's Leveler pamphlet from 1648, entitled The Bloody Project. In all undertakings which may occasion war or bloodshed, men have great need to be sure that their cause be right, both in respect of themselves and others. For if they kill men themselves, or cause others to kill without a just cause, and upon extremest necessity, they not only disturb the peace of men and families, and bring misery and poverty upon a nation, but are indeed absolute murderers. Nor will it in any measure satisfy the conscience or God's justice to go on in uncertainties. For in doubtful cases, men ought to stand still and consider until certainty do appear, especially when killing and slaying of men, the most horrid work to nature and Scripture, is in question. Far be it from any man hastily to engage in any undertaking which may occasion a war, before the cause he is to fight for be rightly and plainly stated, well considered, and thoroughly understood to be just, and of absolute necessity to be maintained. Nothing being more abominable in the sight of God or good men than such persons who run but to shed blood for money, or to support this or that other interest, but neither consider the cause for which they engage, nor aught else but pay, interest, honor, etc. And because it best consists with their present honor, profit, or humors, make it their business to pick quarrels and increase divisions, so that they may fish in the waters which they themselves have troubled. Writing at the height of the second phase of the English Civil War in August 1648, Walwyn witnesses in dismay the resumption of fighting to no other purpose than to shed blood for money and to promote and secure self-interest. It is the essence of the bloody project to go on in uncertainties in pursuit of power or of enrichment, or to defend those already enriched. A project is etymologically something that is thrown forth, hence the inexorable process Walwyn's tract comments upon culminates in showers of projectiles. Throwing forth, moving forward, refusing to stop, refusing to consider alternatives, but seeking to engage, rushing, seizing, killing, maiming. The aggressiveness of the project as it barrels ahead, leaving everyone aghast at its violence and the nakedness of its motives, signifies for Walwyn a criminal betrayal of trust. A similar point had previously been made by Richard Overton in his pamphlet A Remonstrance of Many Thousand Citizens, which was addressed to Parliament, whose power, the author points out, quote, was only of us but a power of trust, which is ever revocable and cannot be otherwise, and to be employed to no other end than our own well-being. If in the bloody project the deferral of Walwyn and the Levelers' ambitious hopes for the adoption of their revolutionary constitution accounts for part of the tone, what is clearly foremost in Walwyn's mind is the sheer irresponsibility of all antagonistic parties, none of whom seek to proceed with reasoned deliberation, but act peremptorily and arbitrarily, with no sense of those on whose authority and in whose interest they act. A trust exists when one has authorized someone to act on one's behalf and in one's best interest. In the context of property law, the trustee takes title to property on behalf of another person and for that person's benefit. As Scott notes, it's Austin Wakeman Scott, a famous law professor. As Scott notes, the trustee undertakes the burdens of ownership while providing the benefits of ownership to the beneficiary of the trust. Although trusts had long existed in England, the OED records the first modern use of the term trustee in 1653, 5 years after Walwyn's, quote, year of dissembling. When one undertakes to be a trustee, in this sense, one assumes certain duties. One of the most fundamental duties, if not the most fundamental, is the duty of loyalty owed to the beneficiary of the trust. By this duty, a trustee must place the interests of the beneficiary first and foremost, must put aside the trustee's own self-interest. To ignore this duty is to be in breach of trust. In the context of the Bloody Project, those pursuing their self-interest at the expense of the nation's best interest have committed a profound breach. Falling prey to conflicts of interest of the most devastating kind, they have become absolute murderers. Yet one day, Walwyn tells us, those in breach will, quote, come to judgment, and then their consciences will be as 1,000 witnesses against them. For presumably in the interior litigation of conscience, self-incrimination is fully encouraged. A breach is a breaking. To breach a trust is to break apart a relationship of trust, to expose as false the presumption that confidence has been well placed. When the break occurs, the conventions hitherto governing the relationship start to fail. The entire apparatus becomes subject to question and liable to collapse. Subordinated self-interest reveals itself as rivalry, as competition. As a breach lays bare the competing interests, the energy formerly devoted to maintaining the bond of trust now obliterates it. All the elements previously held in place are spun free, to be reinterpreted as products of the breach. Turning to our contemporary cultural context, it is commonplace to think of ourselves living today in among the breaches, where Dunn's all in pieces, all coherence gone continues to be watchword, where the subordination of self-interest is regarded as suspiciously archaic, especially in contrast to the confident and ubiquitous spectacles of self-absorption and self-aggrandizement we daily see. In such a time, it may be difficult to restate and reaffirm a trust, particularly through works of art that see themselves as products of a loss of trust and appear to take great pains to embody the resulting alienation. To approach this, I would like to think specifically about the case of contemporary poetic texts that find themselves all in pieces as a sort of precondition. Works that presuppose the breach because comprised in it and constituted by it. These difficult texts appear to be left on their own to form new networks and new relationships. They rise from the broken landscapes they inhabit to seek out trusts with those who will take them up and respond to them, assess their truth. Through their seemingly opaque and sporadic gestures, these splintered pieces come gradually to be refitted by conjecture, always with gaps and overlaps, and always prone to collapse. But the activities they solicit are the reasons they exist in the forms they do. They are loyal to the world they find themselves in and compel an active reading of that world. Through unyielding attention to chosen materials, the poet derives a living conjectural moment of artistic intelligence to stand as part of the world, constructed from that world's accretions, a growth out of them. I seem to be so thirsty these days. The result may be thoroughly perplexing. As Adorno notes, quote, regard for the object rather than for communication is suspect in any expression. Anything specific not taken from pre-existent patterns appears inconsiderate, a symptom of eccentricity, almost of confusion. To establish the trust, to maintain one's loyalty to the object, is apparently to breach one's loyalty to the reader. Yet in a compelling text, the rejection of pre-existent patterns and the refusal to compromise elicit a fresh experience of the world and motivate the reader's responsive conjecture. Through the breach, the broken world is brokenly visible, the mirror scattered in pieces and yet capable of fragmentary, non-contiguous forms and images, which challenge the intellect to construe in fulfillment of the trust implicitly imposed. If the ordering impulse can never fully counteract the multitude of breaches the text records, yet it drives one's immersion into its networks, so conjecture thereby a space where intelligence can recover itself. The word conjecture was originally used in the context of divination. It literally means throw together, and presumably relates to ancient divination practices such as geomancy, which involve throwing dirt or pebbles and reading one's future out of the resulting patterns. In 1653, the philosopher Henry Moore published his Conjectura Cabalistica, an explication of the first 3 chapters of Genesis by means of the threefold Kabbalah, namely the literal, the philosophic, and the mystical Kabbalah. Here the act of threefold conjecturing draws out the old Renaissance tradition of relating everything to everything else, of finding structures enfolded within structures, a Neoplatonic tendency culminating at least in boldness of titular ambition in Ralph Cudworth's massive and encyclopedic Confutation of Atheism, True Intellectual System of the Universe. Still the greatest title of all time. And I'm proud to have stolen part of it. That was 1678. In this tradition, Sir Thomas Browne's The Garden of Cyrus, or the quincunxial lozenge or network plantations of the ancients, artificially, naturally, mystically considered in 1658, shares with these learned and encyclopedic texts a speculative open-endedness, reflecting the associative mode of writing they pursue. Sometimes, as Browne notes, imagination is apt to rove, and conjecture keep no bounds. The leisurely pace of conjectural works like The Garden of Cyrus, with its curiously extended meditations, its various subject matter, its microscopic ruminations, its elaborate syntax and abstruse diction, a leisurely pace which literally puts its author to sleep at the end of the text, requires some readerly patience to, quote, perceive the elegancy of its conjectural processes. Reading Browne's text, one is drawn into an associative practice of cross-referencing all nature and history in terms of one motivating, organizing principle, the decussation, or X-shaped arrangement of 5 points known as the quincunx, and that's the first deal here. Trees are still planted in these patterns, by the way. The decussation that Browne sees as the proliferating network of the universe. Paradoxically, the more Browne insists on locating his fundamental decussation in every seed, plant, animal, artifact, and symbol, the less order he brings to the process, the more overgrown his text becomes. Conjecture sprouts from conjecture, and what was an attempt to order degenerates into a wilderness, a textual wilderness of total heterogeneity, where all the textual elements conspire to arrest one's passage as each detail unfolds into the next. Naturally, I admire this quality. J.H. Prynne's 1998 pamphlet, Red D. Gypsum, Prynne, like the Levelers, tends to announce himself in pamphlets, offers a severe challenge to his readership. The poem is unreadable according to any conventional approach to reading. Written in pairs of taut rectangles of 8 lines each, taking up 13 pages, the poem's very title trips us up in the stuttering pun on Red D, which announces itself like a speed bump. While many features of typical Prynne texts are present, the admixtures of technical diction, the chunky, retarding rhythms cut against a dense, ongoing sweep of syntax, the skewed, twisting imperatives, the micro shifts up and down registers of rhetoric, now clipped and demotic, now lofty with an acid beauty, the entire performance looks and feels even more compressed than usual, as if terrific forces have squeezed out all connective material, forcing the remaining words to connect themselves directly with one another. This formal impression is only heightened by actual engagement with a text in which the swirl of verbal activity begins to seem all suggestive, even though no phrase is ever allowed to conclude in the same context in which it begins. One suspects that the very letters shift context as the words are read. And Prynne's analysis of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in his talk Stars, Tigers, and the Shapes of Words indicates that such ideas have occurred to him. Or rather, suggestiveness is an inherent aspect of this extreme density. The shifts and changes are kaleidoscopic objects in and of themselves, not to be distended or watered down by an effort to communicate through pre-existent patterns. The poem's epigraph is from Lillian Chu, author of Managing Derivative Risks. Quote, "The volatility smile is not symmetrical." This asymmetrical smile is evidently not a smile, but a smirk, or perhaps a grimace. It refers to a phenomenon in options trading first noticed after the 1987 Dow Jones collapse, as investors reacted to the until then unheard of phenomenon of the New York Stock Exchange losing 20% of its value in one day. The chance of a profound market drop or rise causes certain stock options to be prized at an unexpected premium. When these prices are plotted, the result is an elongated U shape, hence a smile. Certainly the concept of volatility seems appropriate to a text that swings so widely and quickly through a range of references, effects, and contexts. Likewise, the strangely self-referential character of options contracts themselves, which are essentially complex side bets derived from the main market bet, finds its equivalent in various derivatives and verbal back formations found in the text. But one notes crucially that option strategies evolved to hedge portfolios within margins of safety can, if managed poorly, lead to sudden, catastrophic losses, as in the case of the Barings Bank, which collapsed in a period of a few months thanks to the unsupervised, irresponsible, and dishonest trading practices and activities of Nicholas Leeson, whose breaches of trust are covered in Chu's book. The confluence of greed, panic, arrogance, negligence, and dissimulation suggests the human chaos roiling beneath the complacently mathematical volatility smile. In reality, the smile is a rictus of panic, the panic of the breach, the free fall. The smile is half an ellipse. An ellipse is a conic section that etymologically falls short in terms of the angle of the intersecting plane and the base of the cone. As a figure of speech, an ellipsis likewise falls short. Putnam calls it the figure of default or defect. When the poet defaults, he or she has omitted a word or words, causing the utterance to fall short of completeness. Usually this default is easily remedied by paying in the absent words. For this is a device of ordinary concision and is not designed to enigmatize the text. That's my word. But an ellipsis is a kind of breach. And nowadays, when we call something elliptical, we mean something has become enigmatic in ways similar to what Putnam calls the close conceit, or hidden idea he associates with the figure noema. To characterize Prynne's text as defaulted would be an understatement. You bring order and tide over, produce Elysian's disparate reversion to wet climbing by a crook intern, backed to relish affirming deterrence. Flashing remix over its wing circles, will pinion stacks over plaster, blue sticker branded for both took parting. Shook to gain what both heard, aside from penance, stripping, tinker phantom bark entire, baying red gape, still bite intruded, awakened to leaf right through a fully shattered book. This passage features one of the few personal pronouns in the text, which otherwise seems to be mainly addressing itself. The usual riddles slink through here. Is tide a verb or noun? Same question for remix, gain. What is the antecedent of its? Both, what or who? What is a stillbite? It's a mineral. And what is a baying red gape? Has red grape been defaulted to red gape? Has stripped bark metamorphosed into canine baying? Is the phrase fully shattered book adequate to address what is happening here? Elsewhere, this text is studded with chunks of odd diction drawn from a variety of places. Ataraxy, lignin, chrysothrix, avulsed, or this. Mydriatic, gaping, hollow, lenting, anting, parox, retorst. Quiet now. This material is not to be controlled from any central point of readerly understanding, even after shutting one's encyclopedia or signing off Google. Yet going on in uncertainties with attentiveness creates a different kind of reading experience, owing to Prynne's method of seeding the work with clusters of recurrent points of reference, a word, a phrase, a half-word, half-phrase, linking up through coordination of half-sounds or half-meanings, points that unexpectedly expand in and through successive readings. The closer one looks, the more one sees. Transgressions, breaches, elisions are at the same time multiform enfoldings, tightly compressed networks, nodes of reference linking and unlinking across pages and sentences. As defiantly autonomous as the text appears, as one works through the histories collapsed within individual words, the paratactic unspoolings of the syntax, the strange subterranean connections back and forth across the pages from phrase to phrase, word to word, syllable to syllable, one comes to divine a principle of growth, quote, demerged in the world. Demerged, an old word meaning immersed, would on its face appear to denote separation. Prynne's characteristically fluid use of it within the floating shadows of context past and present leaves the issue undecided, neither one nor the other, but both. We are immersed and separated. Red D. Gypsum has become a thing of the world to unfold with and of the world, and within and of itself. The poem connects as it breaches, contracts as it proliferates. The gypsum of the title, in its red form having been stained by iron oxides, so I'm told, is a versatile rock with a variety of uses within building trades, including plaster and alabaster for the Renaissance scholars in the room. Thin plates of gypsum are also used as polarizing filters in petrographic microscopes used to look at thin slivers of rock, where they operate essentially as red filters. The results can be spectacular. Crimpen interfold your spectral yellow, taunted now slippery bright, red gully regain through the wood rewound in felt. And so it goes through clusters of words from mineralogy, botany, anatomy, options trading. There are the usual blunt imperatives, get resold on redemption, with the triple pun on resold. Many references to bark, including the phrase, Bark Detour Press, which calls up the book itself, published by Bark Press. And this helpful note from the world of investments. Facile ketone derivatives will instigate regraded bond preening. Those of us who've actually seen a bond preening will, it's not a pretty sight. The yield to maturity. All of this play flows through a certain transfer points, almost too elusive to name, marked by repeating clusters, bark, root, seed, red, suggestive of highly cerebral improvisation. And the letter D, here in the cover. Raised D flash on its matte red square. This is the cover of the book. Which came first? And I can't not think about the raised D in a square that is the trademark of the Square D Company, renowned for its electric switches, and I've provided there for you. Here is a Square D ad from the 30s. Tonight, in thousands of homes, lights will unexpectedly go out. In some of these homes, vexed and embarrassed hostesses, dressed for a formal party, will make cautious, candle-lighted trips to dusty basements to replace a blown fuse. At least they're not calling their trust officer to do it for them. Sorry. To replace a blown fuse. In other homes, those in which a Square D multi-breaker has been installed, carefully dressed hostesses will merely flip a lever and the light will be restored. Following the breach, the circuit is reformed. A vexed, candlelit, but carefully dressed descent to the dusty id has been avoided. All those forgotten meanings stuffed in the basement can sleep on in darkness. The brief, lightless moment is merely a prelude to a future of easy, continuous illumination. This little narrative contains 2 three-dot ellipses. The presence of an encyclopedia in a poem brings up for me the vision of Sir Thomas Browne writing in his study, thinking about the number 5. By the same number doth nature divide the circle of the sea star, and in that order and number disposeth those elegant semicircles or dental sockets and eggs in the sea hedgehog. And no mean observations hereof there is in the mathematics of the Neatite's retiary spider, which concluding in 44 circles from 5 semi-diameters beginneth that elegant texture. To look at the tiny seeds of duckweed is irresistibly to associate. He that would discern the rudimental stroke of a plant may behold it in the original of duckweed at the bigness of a pin's point, from convenient water and glasses, wherein a watchful eye may also discover the puncticular originals of periwinkles and gnats. This watchful method of writing and inquiry conjoins sense and ocular observation with rational conjecture, Browne's term, to trace the labyrinths of truth. By its means, Browne teases out vast networks of associated objects, revealing intricate orderings submerged in the text of the Book of Nature. Sometimes the decussation is literally submerged. Observable rudiments there are hereof in subterraneous concretions and bodies in the earth, in the gypsum or talcum rhomboids. Both in the Garden of Cyrus and its companion text, Hydriotaphia, there are many queries, conjectures, mysteries, and hints left to fortunate posterity to pursue, now that we'll have the example of Browne's texts and methods. By means of these deferred queries and conjectures, Browne creates a sense of open-endedness, of myriad explications yet to unfold. Even in those cases where Browne goes out of his way to exclude certain items from consideration, which happens quite frequently, he invariably and elaborately lists them, complete with attendant descriptions and digressions, so that they become as much a part of his text as its ostensible subject matter. To omit is also to include. The network fills beyond capacity. Roving imagination and boundless conjecture strain against the unhurried periods that contain them. The resulting fullness represents an engendering and recreative response to the world. For imagination and the conjectural method it powers derive from nature. Not only does the text demonstrate the proliferating order it describes, both unfold from the same seminal principle. For Browne, the Book of Nature is a trust. He has maintained and held that trust by observing and making connections. This is both vigilance and a commitment to the ever-growing object. For Browne, the alert, resourceful reader of the continuous text of nature and art completes the circuit by recreating it in his own text. The world is revealed in the puncticular, in the thwart enclosure and furdling of flower and blossom before explication, in the seed-like cluster, in the vigilantly observed and rendered detail, in rhomboids of gypsum. So Browne, so also the word matrices and constellations of Prynne. If the elusiveness of Prynne's text renders any reading conjectural, no reading definitive, the same can be said of Prynne's contemporary Tom Raworth. In the print poem we have just looked at, the multiform shifts retarded the reader's movement through the text. By contrast, in Raworth's recent text, comparable shifts actually propel us down the page, sending us headlong until we are out of breath. No doubt much of this is owed to the brevity of Raworth's line and the near total absence of punctuation in points. Yet if the breaches speed by, they are there nonetheless, pouring their energies into the text, which we scramble to register in return. Reading through with the velocity implied by Raworth's technique offers a different experience of conjectural synthesis, as though simultaneously puzzling out actions seen from the window of a speeding train, while also glancing down at one's book and taking the measure of one's fellow passengers. These flexible structures offer no final place to view the action. One has no alternative except to join in the gymnastics. But here I would like to affirm another side of Raworth's art, where movement in time is not a central factor, his art of collage. Sorry about the lousy quality of this, but I got old equipment. It's actually, the squares are actually smaller than this. It's a little enlarged. This is a collage from March 2000. As you can see, it consists of 48 tiny squares arranged in a grid. The squares comprise torn or cut pieces of newspaper, probably from the Sunday color supplement of Raworth's newspaper of choice, The Independent. This, therefore, is a typical Raworth collage in terms of design and materials. Many writers have remarked that Raworth's collages continue the broken narratives of his writing by other means. The present object consists of pictures of writing torn up and layered at various angles. There are at least 4 different writings involved, and everything is handwritten. The bottom layer appears to be medieval calligraphy, presumably Middle English. The upper layers appear to be taken from letters, notes, or manuscripts. The fragments, angled against each other, are quite tiny and unreadable without a magnifying glass. And while one picks up words here and there, only the character of the writing is evident. That is, the medieval is formal, public. The modern appears private, perhaps intimate, but also tentative, as some words are crossed out, as in a rough draft. Whereas many of Raworth's collages comprise torn-up pictures of people or objects, this one is unusual in featuring pictures of words. Words now seen only as shapes, their signifying function having been torn away. One notes the shapes of the letters and the shapes of the papers torn, the play of intersecting angles. One notes especially the ragged edges of the tears, their varying margins, their thicknesses, and above all the compression of these elements within each tiny square. Here is one square from the bottom row. Again, this is an extremely tiny square, so this is blown up a number of times. In the upper right-hand corner of the square, note the tiny tear of paper glued to the very corner in order to mark off an edge to the blank beige strip to its left. This little scrap appears to have been quite carefully torn by the collages precisely to fit this corner. One sees throughout this collage and throughout Raworth's collages generally this detailed labor, this insistence that the breach be effected in just this way. The working of the surface of the collage is punctiliar, not the least because Raworth is working with newsprint. Moving up from this level, the eye reconstitutes the entire grid, assessing the color shades, their collocation and patterning, the overall textures of newsprint and backing, the crisscross of scrawls at oblique angles cut off each way by the thin white lines of the grid. The sense of a visual text, meticulously prepared, plays out into multiple scenes of conjecture. The grid is Raworth's quincunx. There is no limit to the conjectural scenes it orders, both in the completed artifact and in its potential to create new artifacts. The grid is a network in which the torn images unfold their own subsidiary networks at the viewer's conjectural prompting. Toward the beginning of his holy dying, 1651, Jeremy Taylor cataloged some famous deaths. And when the poet Aeschylus was sitting under the walls of his house, An eagle hovering over his bald head mistook it for a stone and let fall his oyster, hoping there to break the shell, but pierce the poor man's skull. Some breaches are fatal. In this case, the intended breach did not occur, for the oyster remained intact, being absorbed into Aeschylus. This is death by unintended breach, death by introjection. The hard alien object is taken literally into the psyche, a movement which violently repeats pearl formation. Not incorporated into the body in the usual way that an oyster is, it maintains its autonomy as the reality that cannot be denied by art. Behind the walls of his house, Aeschylus is marked off from the world, save from above. Up in the sky, nature takes dead aim. The poet who is demerged into the natural world, whose subjectivity transfers to the object, may default by that transformation. Viewed from outside and above, what appears to be an oyster-cracking machine turns out to have no instrumental function as far as nature is concerned. And in the end, only the pearl remains, the hard, puncticular excess. In this instructive tale, nature delivers the final breach. Where Jeremy Taylor is ready to help with his prose and his prayers, perhaps the better advice is the Buddha's last word in the Pali Mahaparinibbana Sutta: vigilance. Look up. Or look back. After leaving the town of Vesali in his alms round, after his alms round and meal, the Buddha slowly turns about to view the town for one last time, quote, with an elephant's look. Buddhaghosa remarks that, quote, the bones of the Buddhas are all connected like a chain. Therefore, at a time when a Buddha looks back, it is not possible for him to turn his neck. Just as a Naga elephant wants to look back turns his whole body, so the Buddha had to turn around. From this elephantine farewell, the aged Buddha proceeds down the final path to the attainment of parinibbana, after which his body is placed on the pyre, which catches fire, quote, of its own accord. In the burning of the Blessed One's body, no cinder or ash of outer skin, inner skin, flesh, tendons, or oil of the joints could be discerned. Only the bone relics remained. Buddhaghosa notes, this means that the relics remained like jasmine buds, like polished pearls, like gold. Among these, quote, the smallest relic was the size of a mustard seed. The bigger relics were the size of a rice grain broken in the middle. The biggest was the size of a kidney bean broken in the middle. Seed, grain, bean, the course of a puncticular, placed in stupas and honored with festivals. Wordsworth's Old Cumberland beggar, whose solitary, silent, downward-cast poverty subtends an endangered rural continuity, draws forth periodic acts of compassion through his regular alms rounds. Still stuck in the first passage from the Levelers. Until it becomes, quote, a record which together binds past deeds and offices of charity, else remembered. Like Aeschylus, the rock, the beggar folds into nature. His recurrences are as predictable as the phases of the moon. The oblivion he occupies, staring steadfastly at the ground, is to be a part of nature. His idle computation, as he sorts through his scraps and crumbs, is opposed to the instrumental computation that the poet bluntly warns us the statesmen have in store for us. Rather, his mendicant traverses help confirm an apparently uncalculated trust in the rural social order. But to remove him to the workhouse would expose the breach his rock-like presence fills. The picture of a sustaining private charity in this poem addresses the larger social breach at the moment the clouds grow dark. One's duty is regulative here, as in the trust we thought about earlier. The slackening of self-interest announces a transfer to the objective world where one keeps trust, as in Wordsworth's famous apostrophe to duty. Give unto me made lowly wise, the spirit of self-sacrifice, the confidence of reason give. And in the light of truth, thy bondman, let me live. Truth ratifies trust. The truth of the material affirms our preoccupation with it as readers and writers. This issues in commitment. This is the latest on the subject from a new, as yet unfinished manuscript by the American poet Larry Price, whose brilliant poetic allegories have set the standard for imaginative intelligence in contemporary poetry. As the client of a nation having woven violence and self-loathing so starkly within its ruinous operation that to be myself I must hide myself, let me state here and always that this useless national strategy of embracing contradiction, even of nothing to the point of nothing, is not a figure in anyone's imagined future, but is, and here will be, and everywhere, if so pursued, the absence of all existence. Because it is only in the facts of our proximal extensions, our imaginal life, that our existence comes to be at all. I do not bind myself to death. I will not limit my work in order to eternalize it, end quote. Nor will I offer even one penny of my human capital to national renewal unless it is irrevocably in the interests of a one. This is my Ars Poetica. Finally, to keep trust is not to compromise. The interjection here of end quote marks a residual hesitation, even as the force of the statement drives through it to the conclusive and vivifying, this is my Ars Poetica. Only a limitless work fulfills the duty implied in the irrevocable donation of one's human capital. The one is the conjectural unity of work and world in the defiance of zero-sum duality seen through the breach. In one more term, I think of Borges concluding his meditation on Zeno's paradox. We, the undivided divinity within us, have dreamt the world. We have dreamt it as firm, mysterious, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time. But in its architecture we have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason, which tell us it is false. The crevices revealed by paradox undermine the conceptual trust that bears us through a place bound to death. Falsehood is the truth revealed by the breach. To cure the breach, we conjecture a continuity, a one, a proximal extension that authorizes us and makes us responsible. For language has fallen into our hands. As keepers of the trust, we travel the endless dialogic way of Bakhtin. There is neither a first nor a last word, and there are no limits to the dialogic context. It extends into the boundless past and the boundless future. Even past meanings, that is, those born in the dialogue of past centuries, can never be stable, finalized, ended once and for all. They will always change, be renewed, in the process of subsequent future development of the dialogue. At any moment in the development of the dialogue, there are immense, boundless masses of forgotten contextual meanings. But at certain moments of the dialogue's subsequent development, they are recalled and invigorated in renewed form, in a new context. Nothing is absolutely dead. Every meaning will have its homecoming festival, the problem of great time. By means of its backward gaze, the elephant contains all this, from eon to eon, the infinite extending from us and through us in time, our homecomings and leave-takings, the sustaining machines of a defaulted paradise. The passage into the boundless future will not define itself except against ignorance and oblivion. To revive a word, one must know why it was said and what conjectural potential it stores. The connection is effected instantaneously, from point to point. Writing is the flesh of this geometry. Great time, slow time, lost time, no limit. I observe the position of my limbs being fed upon early in the morning. The severed head has not grown back, and our feelings have become posterior to sense, which would otherwise have fought against their eviction. In rare cases when they recover their former transparency, what appear to have been lost were prescinded beforehand by words or phrases such as believe, expect, may fluctuate. Should we acquiesce in them, neither we nor they will have moved an inch. Although rounding into view, damp and redundant, the brain peers into tranquility, raging as it vibrates like a sweet potato vine. That's it.